Welcome to the Sphinx Thinks podcast. I'm Georgina Holmes, and we'll be progressing through time to uncover the mysterious world of life on Earth, from the emergence of life and evolution of us, to the first civilisations and innovations which got us where we are today. I hope you enjoy the show.
We're not on some kind of straight upward trajectory, that evolution is obviously still happening, that we didn't evolve from primates, that we evolved alongside them. The more you study primates, the more you understand what it is to be human.
In today's episode, I will be discussing primatology with Charlotte Frearson. Charlotte works as part of the Institute of Archaeology at University College London, and you'll likely find her behind the UCL Archaeology social media pages. She studied archaeology at Southampton before coming to UCL and completing her master's in human evolution and animal behaviour, focusing on, you guessed it, primates. So, let's dive in. So, Charlotte, as an introduction, what is primatology?
Okay, so primatology is specifically the study, behaviour, biology, evolution, taxonomy of non-human primates. So we're all primates, but there are non-human primate cousins, as it were. So anything that's not human but under the primate bracket we study.
And so, what made you decide to do a master's focused on primatology?
So it's a slightly long-winded story. I got into archaeology because I grew up, and I got into archaeology when I was about 4. I lived in the Middle East, and I saw this amazing settlement in the middle of the desert, and I remember thinking I want to study this. So I ended up going through, and then we moved back to Colchester in Essex, and it's all Roman. I thought, this is amazing. I'll do Romans, and I went to university in Southampton to study archaeology specifically. And then when I got there, they have an excellent team of people that teach and study human evolution. And I very swiftly realised that human evolution was more my thing. And I remember we had a professor called James Steele, who still actually teaches now at UCL with us. But he was teaching us about Homo erectus, and he was crawling across a front desk teaching us how Homo erectus wasn't fully bipedal, and he'd crawl around, and it was just so cool. And learning about how far in the past our ancestors went without really learning about that much at school then. And then by I think second year of university, I studied this course called Life Cycles. It's all about human life cycles and primate life cycles, and learning about infancy through to death. And we had this lecturer called Yvonne Marshall, who was spectacular, amazing. You know, it must be like at school having a great teacher. She was the first really great lecturer that spoke to me about human evolution and primates. And I remember she took us to Marwell Zoo in Hampshire, and at Marwell Zoo she studied the Sulawesi macaques. Look up the Sulawesi ones; they're awesome. They're these little black macaques, and they sometimes have really spiky hair on top. And then she took us there, and we looked at the macaques. And I remember going around Marwell, and we were listening to gibbons and looking at all the primates, and then after that, I was like, okay, so we had to do our dissertation. So every university does a dissertation, or every student does a long dissertation, long piece of research in their third year. And I was like, I'm quite practical, I'm not great at library research. So I thought, okay, what can I do? And within an archaeology degree, I somehow managed to do a dissertation on spider monkeys. So spider monkeys have a very long tail, and at the end of the tail, they have a prehensile tail, so they've almost it's almost like another hand or a thumb. So when they hold on to things, they can really grip this tail. Somehow I managed to get my research I did at Colchester Zoo, and I worked there for 3 or 4 months, and I got to go in every morning and sit within not inside the spider monkey enclosure. I wasn't that close to them, but within the walls of it. So I got very close to the spider monkeys. And I ended up watching spider monkeys for 6 weeks all over summer, researching them, writing down their behaviour, and specifically the behaviour of the infants with the other members of the primate group. So not just obviously the mothers, but everybody that interacted with the infants and how they interacted and how they played. And my idea was to not compare it, but to think about it in terms of our human ancestors. So I was watching these spider monkeys, and they were, amazing. When you start watching primates every day, you realize the things that we have in common, you realize how different we are, you realize how amazing they are, the things they can do, that we, like the way they can just climb up a wall and end up hanging from the ceiling. You start watching them in the way they behave with each other. Um, and I'd go around the zoo and look at all the other animals, and it meant I got a free pass to the zoo for the whole summer, which was frankly my dream. I'd go around and watch the other primates as well, but it was specifically the spider monkeys, and watching how they interacted with each other. And from that, I got a better understanding of how humans interact with each other. And you start looking at everything very, differently when you start realizing these are our, they're not, we didn't evolve from primates, we evolved alongside them. So we all have, there are common ancestors from which the primates branched out. And you realize the way, what we've developed, what they've developed, and how we all, have evolved. And it's interesting that obviously I'm looking at them in the zoo, and then you get the kind of moral questions around, should we have primates in zoos, should we have zoos? And I'm sitting there watching them, and they're watching me, and they were very much watching me. Gosh, I wish I knew what they were thinking about me. But so, and then after that I took a year out, and on that year out I read a lot of books about primatology, specifically one called Good Natured by Franz de Waal. Really interesting book about primates and how they help each other. And it's an interesting book, and I read that, and then I found out about the course at UCL run by Professor Volker Sommer, who's a famous primatologist, and he works in India on the Hanuman langurs, and he runs a project in Nigeria called the Gashaka Gumti Chimpanzee Project. And I read all about him and watched some YouTube videos of him talking, and I thought, yes, he's eccentric. I like him. And I applied for the course at UCL to do human evolution and primatology, because it was one of the only courses that really focused on the two side by side. So we learnt about, so that the course was specifically within anthropology, so it's very much bioanth. There was some options for social anthropology and medical anthropology, and some material culture, but I've focused on things like paleoanth, so looking at human evolution, stone tools, how we developed, how we changed over time. And the primatology module was just exceptional. So we obviously went to London Zoo and looked at the primates, and then I ended up doing a dissertation on primates, but ended up going to Berlin Zoo. So I went to Berlin Zoo, and I saw some bonobos for the first time. I'd never seen bonobos before. We're taught that bonobos are the good-natured primates, and obviously that's kind of a nonsense, really. I mean, they are, it's meant to be that chimpanzees are the mean ones, and there's obviously differences between them. So I ended up in that, and then ended up doing another dissertation on primates. And then for some reason I left the field after that, but have always stayed in reading about them.
Well, so many traits that are seen in different primate groups can be linked to human behaviour. So I just want to pick up that you were studying them in zoos, and do you think it's better to study primates in zoos, and do you think that gives an accurate representation of their behaviour, or better if you could have studied them in the wild?
Yeah, I mean, I would have much rather studied them in the wild, absolutely. And it was very specifically noted that I was studying them in zoos. It wasn't at all like, this is an accurate study of spider monkeys. It was very much, this is a study of captive spider monkeys, and what that can tell us. And obviously captive spider monkeys interact with humans every day. I remember once I had a moment with them. One of them took my hand and sniffed it. That was it. It touched my hand for some reason. I was obviously too close, but it touched my hand. He touched my hand rather, and then he sniffed it, and I was like, okay. And I sniffed mine, and it just smelled like poo. I was like, wow, we've had a moment. It's a beautiful moment. Wow, that really smells. But yeah, I think it would have been much better studying them. So my absolute dream study would be looking at my brain's completely gone again. Gelada baboons. There we go. Gelada baboons in Ethiopia. So they are they're grazers, and they graze and they kind of shuffle about, and they're called the bleeding heart monkeys, because a lot of monkeys, like macaques, have big swollen bottoms that show others, what stage they are. But these macaques have the gelada baboons rather have the bleeding hearts, and that would be my absolute dream project, and it still is, to go and study them in the wild. I think there's yeah, I would have absolutely loved to. I think it was very much at the time about money. That, obviously it costs a lot to go somewhere like, I think the black spider monkeys I was studying were from Ecuador, and South America, and at that point I couldn't go.
Yeah.
So that kind of throws up the whole, you know, I definitely have reservations about zoos, but I wouldn't have seen them without the zoo. So
Yeah.
it's really, it's one of those discussions that's a whole minefield of morality and what we should do about it. I think I can't even look at orangutans in a zoo anymore because I think orangutans are so human. And
Yeah. And
just looking at an orangutan, I'm like, I can't, because this is literally like, you're a human in a cage. Like,
yeah, it feels wrong.
yeah, absolutely. But I wouldn't have seen an orangutan without being in a zoo. So I find it really complicated, even now, and I'm nearly, well, I won't say how old I am, but older. Um, but it's definitely better, I would say, to study them in the wild, but it does throw up lots of interesting questions studying them in captivity. And I think when I was at Colchester Zoo is an excellent zoo. It's a research zoo. They have researchers there all the time. And I think in some zoos, especially when I was a kid, you see primates and other animals displaying, that kind of repetitive behaviour, that you can tell they're not okay. When cats pace or
Yeah.
and these primates weren't doing that. I wouldn't. Their behaviour wasn't at all natural because obviously they are in captivity. We are holding them in a small cage that's not huge but bigger. Um, so yeah, I would say definitely if you can study them in the wild, do. And I wouldn't say it's the next best thing. I would say it's a thing that if you can't study them in the wild and you have to study them somewhere, then a zoo, you know, will have to do. But I do think in the future we'll all look back and think, gosh, that was an interesting thing to do, put animals in zoos. Equally, I feel the same way about the dog when I'm walking him. I always walk him on the lead because he's a whippet and he'd just run if I let him off on the street. Obviously, cause chaos. But I do think one day people will look back and be like, "You kept dogs on leads?" Yeah, so not a hugely helpful answer, but I guess I'm still, it's complicated for me. I think a lot of what we've learnt from them is beneficial. Yeah, I was thinking about this morning when, uh, how you learn from primates, and obviously someone like Jane Goodall or the lady that studies orangutans is, I think you say her name, Burrito Gaudikas, and um, and there was Diane Fossey as well who studied gorillas, and they were
Mm.
all under Leakey. So they all studied the three different, chimpanzees, orangutans, and gorillas, and that research is, essential. Um, but even when you read some of like Jane Goodall's notes, and I was studying specific behaviours, and she'd come back and say, "My chimpanzees don't display those behaviours," and it was like, okay, but that's bizarre because other people have said they do. Do you not
Yeah.
want them to? So it's a really, yeah, I think it's a um, really interesting area to think about. How should we study them? How we should study them rather.
It's something that really needs thinking about. And I certainly think it'd be preferable to be studying um, animal behaviour in the habitat in which it evolved, in which it learnt these behaviours, rather than in an enclosure where there are many unnatural factors playing a role in what we're observing. So let's take a minute and link primatology back to humanity and what primatology has taught you about humanity and evolution.
Well, I think that's a really interesting question because I suppose I was about 20 when I started studying primates. Um, and I've always been interested in animals. I remember at school, that question I'm sure you've had, what do you want to do? What career do you want to do? And I was very shy at school. So I just said, I want to study rocks or animals. And everybody laughed. And naturally, I've grown up to study rocks and animals because I'm an archaeologist who likes primates. So, it's kind of happened anyway. I think I didn't know much about evolution when I went to university. And we weren't taught about it at school, particularly. I did biology A level, but it was very much focused on human biology, but not evolution. Um, so just going in and learning about how we're not on some kind of straight upward trajectory, that evolution is obviously still happening, that we didn't evolve from primates, that we evolved alongside them, that we have common ancestors where we all, linked together millions and millions of years ago, and that for the first time we are pretty much the first human species on the planet, only human species rather. So before now, there's always been, us and Neanderthals, or Homo erectus and different species at the same time. So I find it really interesting when people talk about human evolution and we're kind of like the pinnacle. And obviously, we're not the pinnacle. We do things wrong all the time. This world certainly isn't perfect. And I think from human evolution, you start learning that people talk about us being like, so amazing. And then you think, well, hang on a minute. Our ancestors were on this planet longer than we have been on this planet. They created the first tools. And I find that absolutely, I mean, I love lithics. I love looking at, we've got some stone tools from Olduvai Gorge at work, and I take them into schools and I always say to the kids, how old do you think this is? And they're like, well, do you know? And I'm like, this is 1,000,000 years old, and this was worked by one of our human ancestors. And I don't think they're particularly impressed by that, but I'm always just like, I love this.
It's so hard to comprehend that, isn't
Yeah.
it?
Yeah, it's almost impossible to think about that, especially when you're talking to like 8-year-olds, to comprehend that amount of time,
Yeah.
and that you're holding something that was made by someone who we are related to but isn't us. And I find, I do flint napping, and I always think about it when I flint nap, how terrible I am at flint napping, and I would not have done well. And you just think about, I think something that human evolution has really taught me is that we don't, you can't think about our ancestors as, I don't like using the word, but like the word primitive. They weren't. Obviously, they weren't. They survived. They hunted. When they started eating meat and started using fire, and started using tools. And I find it really interesting when I was at university, they started depicting women in human evolution drawings, more and more doing things. So when I started, it was always like the women would sit around the fire and the men would be hunting. And it's like, why are we even putting our 20th century, 21st century ideals on, our ancestors 1,000,000 years ago?
Yeah, they were certainly a lot more egalitarian.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't see how they couldn't have been. So when you see things like the Victorian ideals of our human ancestors, it's bizarre to me that, why do we assume just because we are not particularly egalitarian that, they weren't? Um, but then looking at primates and looking at how structures of societies. So I remember when I was working with the spider monkeys, there was one particular spider monkey who was tiny. He was an adult, but he was very small, and he had a problem with one of his hands. So spider monkeys only have 4 digits,
Mm.
and he had, on one hand, he had no digits at all. And the idea is, if you read Frans de Waal, in the wild he probably wouldn't have survived because it's kind of not exactly survival of the fittest, because I don't really like that phrase, but he probably wouldn't have survived because he couldn't eat. He couldn't walk very well, but because he was in a zoo, he could. Um, and I think we do put a lot of, so again, thinking about the chimpanzees and the bonobos, we always talk about how it's kind of a pros and cons of looking at primates when we talk about evolution and us, and how we take the best traits. So we look at monkeys and we're like, oh, they don't, they're so calm. And look at the bonobos, they're so calm and they all love each other. And that's, kind of like us. And then the chimpanzees are very violent.
Completely. And yet they're our closest living ancestor.
Yeah. So you've got bonobos, chimpanzees, orangutans, gorillas, all of our closest ancestors. Yet we seem to take what we want from them in terms of what they do. And we justify our behavior by looking at them. And I find that really difficult to deal with, because you can't just take one element of that, and then you start looking at their societies. So orangutans are quite solitary, and they look after their infants, I think, for something like 7 years before the infant leaves the mother. But then you get chimpanzees living in massive groups, and all it tends to be the females live together and the males live together. And obviously that doesn't reflect our Western society, or society in Europe or America. It does elsewhere, but I don't know. I find human evolution absolutely fascinating, thinking about the really deep time, and it's made me read more history. So I didn't even do history at school, certainly not for A level. And you realise that people don't know recent history, let alone the history of,
The,
prehistory.
yeah.
Yeah, really, really deep history. Um, so I think, the more you study primates, the more you understand what it is to be human, both the pros and cons of that. So, you know, you start looking at I think I was watching something the other day that were like, humans are the only species to kill just because we can kill. But then there are instances of chimpanzees doing that. There's a video, and we were shown this horrific video when we were at university, and it was the first time I'd ever heard trigger warning, and it was 2005. And our lecturer Volker was like, "You can leave the room if you need to," and I was like, "Oh gosh, what is this?" And it was a chimpanzee attack on another chimpanzee,
Yeah.
and it was shocking because I'd never seen that before. And you start thinking, okay, so this hasn't been talked about, but we have to take this with everything else we take from them, in terms of their behavior, what they
Mm.
do, what we do. Um, and yeah, the more we study primates, the more we understand who we are, I think, and what we should, basically how we shouldn't let them, die out. Um,
Yeah.
how we should look after them better, especially, orangutans. When you start thinking, I don't eat palm oil because of knowing about the orangutan habitat across Asia, or across, Borneo and Sumatra around there, um, and just understanding how we should conserve these animals and what they mean to us. That we're not the only, in effect, we're not the only species of, primates. We're surrounded. You go from lemurs all the way to us. Go from a mouse lemur, which is like, I think the size of like the head of a toothbrush. That's our our relatives in it, in effect. And
Yeah.
then I've always wanted to go to Madagascar and see the lemurs, and
No, that.
especially eye-eyes. If you don't know what an eye-eye is, look it up. It's so cool. They have a really long finger that they poke at trees with. Oh, again, I did see one in London Zoo once. They don't have them anymore. Um, but again, I wouldn't have seen that without a zoo. But anyway, but yeah, I think for me, studying human evolution, I found it very calming and reassuring that we are evolving still. Because I think before that, you don't really think about it. If you're not studying it, you don't necessarily think about the fact that we're obviously constantly evolving, we're constantly changing, and this isn't it. Because I think sometimes, especially, I'm quite a cynical person at the moment, and I get quite disappointed with how the world is, and I'm like, it's okay, it's
Yeah.
okay. There have been others before us, there'll be others after us. They might do better.
A huge thank you to Charlotte for being my first podcast guest. We discussed many interesting topics, from studying primate behaviour, including in zoos, her own interests, and their links to humanity. Please leave a rating and comment, and if you have any suggestions for future episodes, please get in touch. I'm at the Sphinx Thinks on Instagram, Sphinx_Thinks on Twitter, and you can find my website www.sphinxthinks.com. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and next week I'll be talking to Kat Hobater about chimpanzee communication.